Hey guys, and welcome. What's going on? And welcome back to the Science of Exercise, where we take the miss out of misinformation. So I had a really good conversation with a good friend of mine, and his name is Joe McMiller. He is the owner of True Warrior Ascension, and he is also a personal trainer. Joe was very clear in this conversation. He said that the barbell hip thrust is king for glute hypertrophy and believes that it is the primary exercise to increase muscle mass specifically within the glutes. And I said, you know what, Joe? I disagree, and the literature doesn't necessarily support that. Although Instagram would say otherwise, and all the booty pictures and all the booty exercise seems to be the barbell hip thrust. All right, so the first piece of evidence that I'm going to use to support my statements is going to be by Neto et al. Or Neto et al. And this was a systematic review looking at EMG activity. Now, EMG activity is essentially sensors that are going to be placed over top of the tissue that we're looking at to see how much activation there is. So within this study, actually, the highest EMG activity for glute hypertrophy, specifically glute maximus, is actually the step-up variation at 169.22 plus or minus 101.47. So obviously there's a high variability here, but the step-up seems to show the most EMG activation. Well, what's up next? Well, next in line would be the hex bar deadlift, and this is at 88 plus or minus 16, so not nearly as much variation here. Well, okay, wait a minute. We said that the barbell hip thrust was king. We said it was king. So where is the barbell hip thrust for EMG activity? And it's at 82.37 plus or minus 16 or 18.65. And it's trailing behind the step up and now the hex bar deadlift for glute activation through EMG readings. Well, dang. All right, so where's the squat in this thing? Well, the squat is so low that it's down in the 26 range. Actually, to be specific, they tested different forms of that back squat. They went through partial range of motion, parallel, and then full range of motion, with full range of motion having the lowest activation at 26.56 plus or minus 12.33. All right, so activation. Let's go ahead and follow this EMG activation up with another study. And this study was done by Contreras et al. And again, similar results. The barbell hip thrust showed about 69.46 plus or minus 32.64, so a little higher variability there. And the back squat showed 29.35 plus or minus 16.45. And again, think about this as the magnitude or how much activation there is. The higher the number, the more activation. So the hip thrust blows the back squat, the full range back squat out of the water, almost by twofold, if not potentially in these other studies, 3- and 4-fold more. Well, wait a minute. All right, let's look into this thing a little bit further. So EMG activation shows that the step up is king, hex bar deadlift is secondary, and tertiary would be the hip thrust. And there's some other exercises that I'm leaving out. And again, you can interpret this data because I'm going to go ahead and pull these things in for you. But the barbell back squat is way down there for activation. So we would say that's not a great exercise for muscle mass, specifically within glute maximus. Hold your horses, not so fast. So we go on to read another study. And this is by Brad Schoenfeld. And this is actually more of what we would consider a systematic review. So it looks at a bunch of other studies and brings that data in. So it's not original itself, but it has original research studies. And it teases out a bunch. And essentially it looks at different ranges of motion for exercises. So now we're talking about range of motion, not just activation or EMG activation. We're talking about what is the range of motion of the exercise. So essentially what Brad Schoenfeld saw in their systematic review was, if you want to maximize glute hypertrophy, it would probably be a good idea to increase your range of motion. All right, let's backtrack, right? We just said that the full range squat had the lowest level of activation, 2 to 4-fold less than the barbell hip thrust, depending on which study you look at, or systematic review. But they just said that full range of motion is important. Well, the barbell hip thrust is a very small range of motion in comparison to a very deep squat or a deep step up. All right, let's keep looking here. So again, let's bring this thing full circle. We're talking about glute hypertrophy here. We're trying to figure out which exercises are the best for maximizing glute maximus hypertrophy. So the next study I have supports the concept of straight up looking at muscle growth. So the first couple of studies we looked at activation, not growth, but activation of the muscle. The third study that I mentioned is actually considered more of a review, and it said a full range of motion is more ideal for maximizing muscle hypertrophy, specifically within the lower body. All right, so now I have a study that looks into 2 exercises, the barbell hip thrust versus a full range of motion back squat. Which one increases the most amount of muscle mass? This study was done by Barbalho et al. And what they looked at was the full range of motion back squat versus the hip thrust. They took an image and they looked at how much growth there was within the muscle, and that image can penetrate the tissue. And what they saw was, when they looked at pre-data and post-data after the training routine and training cycle, that the barbell back squat actually increased muscle thickness in these females that were resistance trained by 9.42%. That is a pretty robust outcome. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at that barbell hip thrust that had more activation but less range of motion. Well, a 3.66% increase in that group. That is what we would call significant difference between groups, or a p-value of less than 0.001. Now, 2 millimeters of thickness, if you were to do the math and you were to go back to that chart, 2 millimeters of thickness doesn't seem like a lot. But in muscle world, 2 millimeters of thickness is a pretty big difference, especially in already resistance-trained individuals. So, next study I'm going to go ahead and pull up is Delgado et al. And they make a very practical statement saying, you know what, that barbell hip thrust, although it might not be king, it shows some good levels of activation, but it's simple. It's simple to do. It's relatively safe. And I really like that practical application piece. So does that mean that the barbell hip thrust is just throw it out, it's no good? Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying at all. I actually think it has a really good place in newer trained athletes, or people that are what we consider newbies in the world. They're learning how to resistance train. It's a relatively simple exercise that can help grow the glutes. So overall, what are my thoughts? Well, I'll tell you right now, I am pretty confident where the literature stands right now, and the evidence seems to support that the barbell hip thrust is not king when it comes to glute hypertrophy. The barbell back squat and full range of motion clearly showed a greater increase in muscle hypertrophy, specifically within the glute maximus region, so the booty. The hip thrust clearly took a second place in a one-on-one study. Now, when we talk about the activation and range of motion, the activation isn't king, and it's not the only thing that we need to look at. We need to also look at range of motion. The hip thrust is a relatively short range of motion when it goes to flexion and then extension. You're talking, minimal degrees. Now you talk about a deep squat, there's a lot of flexion to a lot of extension. And that's essentially what the glute maximus does. It creates that from the origin insertion where that glute max is. That's what glutes max main purpose is to create extension from a deep flexed position in the hip. And let's remember that at the end of the day, it's the amount of work done that actually helps maximize muscle growth. What is work? That is force production over a distance. Force production is that tension that we're referring to, or the load that we're overcoming. The distance is the range of motion. If you want to maximize work output, you have to think about that equation. So for all you IG booty bumpers out there hip thrusting like there's no tomorrow, I'm not hating on you. I ain't hating on you one bit. I'm just telling you that if that's the only exercise you're doing for glute growth and that's your priority exercise, or that's the exercise you're prioritizing for your glute hypertrophy, I would say rethink that approach. Give full range of motion back squats and full range of motion step ups and lunges a little bit more of your time, and I think you're going to maximize your glute hypertrophy a little bit more. Add those deadlifts in too. It ain't a bad idea, but don't just be doing hip thrusts alone. So thank you, Joe, for asking the question and really bringing that to my attention. Hopefully you guys were able to gain some knowledge and take that miss out of misinformation.